chosen by many developing countries. No doubt that such a progress was possible to be made thanks to the peace we managed to maintain for last 66 years after the Korean War. I can tell with confidence that peace building and keeping is definitely a necessary condition for development, albeit it may not be the sufficient condition. On the other hand, because we have steadily developed our economy and established a governance system that worked and sustained, we were able to manage the stability of the society within control despite occasional turbulence and not to fall into destructive state of turmoil that might have led to another war in the Korean Peninsula. Last year at this Jeju forum, the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs co-hosted with the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies a session titled The Peace and Development Nexus, whilst we, KOICA and KAIDEC, co-hosted a session about the Asian Networks and Development Cooperation. Logically, it seems nicely themed this year as a next step of what we have discussed last year to focus on the Asia-Pacific region in order to see how donors and partners in this region have been working together for building sustaining peace and thus sustainable development. The post-directional, mutually reinforcing nature of relationship between the peace and development suggests that we need to and even should work together at every stage of the transition process of conflicting or fragile states in order to build a virtuous circle, not vicious circle, where a peaceful condition is secured away from conflict, violence, or disasters. Then the accountability of the government is regained by means of building robust legal and institutional arrangements and providing basic public services to the citizens and businesses. And finally, where the capacity of the government is enhanced for efficient and transparent administration and for policy formulation and implementation for all citizen groups, including children, women, and the vulnerable, leaving no one behind. All this for sustaining the peace gained at dear cost. In order to promptly respond to this humanitarian call from the international community, and also to tightly link with the Korean government policy, which emphasizes the people-oriented peace and prosperity in Korea and in our partner countries, KOICA is making efforts to initiate various development cooperation programs with our partners that fall in the SDG 16 category. The programs are intended to build and sustain a peace before and after the conflict, dispute, or war, of which specific cases include the unexploded ordnance removal project in Laos, People's Democratic Republic, the Youth Volunteers Project supporting peace and recovery in Darfur, Sudan, and the good governance projects such as the establishment of e-procurement system in Tunisia, to name just a few. I'm pleased to have speakers with us today who will review our recent and past experiences and draw lessons for further improvement. So I'd like to close my welcoming remarks by thanking to the speakers, Professor Kusun Kwon from Seoul Cyber University, Mr. Mohib Iqbal from the Institute for Economics and Peace, and Dr. Ben Katoka from the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. And for distinguished discussants, many thanks to you all. No doubt that today's discussions will lay a stepping stone on which KOICA and the international development cooperation community will enrich their understanding on the nexus of peace and development. I hope all of you enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Peace is really important value for us. For the sake of peace, peace itself is very important. But peace is a necessary condition for development. And I think this is a unique contribution of KAIDEC and KOICA to this Jeju Peace Forum, that's another aspect of peace. And also the Sustainable Development Goal, we are working hard for achieving the Sustainable Development Goal, but 16 is about peace and justice. And today, I think we will have a very great opportunity to discuss. Today, our session is organized not only one particular perspective, but so we invite good scholars, leading scholars in this field from donor perspective and also partners perspective. Especially, we invite Korean scholars and also scholar from Australia and also scholar from Korea, but he is originally coming from Democratic Republic of Congo. And I don't really introduce the speakers. Already Professor Park, Vice President Park introduced the speakers. So I will introduce today's discussant. We have a very distinguished discussants. First, Dr. Jeon Mi-young, please welcome. Yeah. She is Vice Chair of International Committee of our association, and also she is a Senior Research Fellow at the Seoul Foundation of Women and Family Research Institute. And I'd like to introduce Kim Soo-jin, Research Fellow at KOICA. Please welcome. She is leading expertise on this issue in the peace and the fragility. I think we have very good discussant. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeong Ki-young. He's a director, governance director at the Global Green Growth Institute. And Dr. Hong Mun-suk. She is the chair of public affairs in our association. Also, she is the professor at the Gyeonggi University. Well, without further ado, I'd like to first introduce about the rule. We have a very strict time, so I will give you 15 minutes to each presenters, and I will give you 5 minutes for the discussant. Because we have a presentation, so during the presentation, all speakers will move out to the audience, then we will have easy to see the presentations. So after that, we will come back again and we will start the discussions. So the first presenter will be Professor Kwon Gu-sun, who is at the Seoul Cyber Universities. Please. Yeah. So why don't you move?
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to KOICA and KAIDEC to invite me to make this presentation. My topic is revisit to state building and post-Korea war peace building and its implication to Korea's implementation of SDG 16 in fragile states. Because time constraint, I just skip some slide. Actually, Korea has a dual position as a recipient and donor country. So we have a dual perspective as a recipient and donor. Actually, Korea was a consumer of international peace and security apparatus 1945 to 1950. And then after Korean War, ODA, Official Development Assistance, was the only source of capital since our social economy is totally destroyed and devastated by the war. So much assistance in 1950s was focused on military support and humanitarian assistance and relief. So food aid, daily necessities, and some raw materials and basic machinery parts were also provided to meet the basic human needs and rehabilitation of the national economy. But since 1960s, South Korea had transformed its war-torn war economy to rapidly growing industrial economy with concessional loans from international finance institutions such as World Bank and donors and FDIs from many multinational corporations. And finally, we came to end its dependence on foreign aid in 1990s. But compared to economic development, I'd like to highlight democratic governance and human right-based rule of law far left behind in that the physical and structural violence by a state had been rooted for a considerable period of time, almost 30 years. So, but the continuous people's movement and mature civil society paved the way for democratization and brought civilian government in 1980s. So converted as a donor country since 1990s, Korea has become a major financial contributor of the UN peace operation, is deploying our well-trained military contingent to UN missions and assuming the chairmanship of UN Peacebuilding Commission in 1917. So we achieved industrialization and democratization through the state building and peace building. But my question is, can the case of South Korea state building and peace building be a model of HDP nexus? And what implication our case have the implementation of the peace agenda of SDG 16 in the countries of fragility? So let me review our state building and post-Korean War peace building, then how our case give implication to donors, Korea as a donor, to achieve SDG 16 goals. Actually, the peace building, the word peace building is started in 1960 and 70, the peace building academia, but UN peace scheme that started peacekeeping, started in 1948. But since 1980s, because of a transition of the Cold War, the armed conflict trend has been changed from interstate armed conflict to intrastate armed conflicts, which call on more multidimensional peacekeeping. So multinational peacekeeping has transitioned their eyes to, we call the negative peace, absence of peace, to more eradicate root causes of conflict. So eradication of the structural violence is needed. So UN has some different type of peace operation ranging from peacekeeping to peacemaking, preventive diplomacy, and peace building, even peace enforcement. So Boutros Ghali, Secretary General of the United Nations, released agenda for peace. In his paper, post-conflict peace building refers to action to identify and support structure which will tend to strengthen and solidify peace in order to avoid the relapse into conflict. But the weakness of this paper is put some word post-conflict. But what about the country in normal situation but very vulnerable to conflict? That was the issue. Well, since then, peace and development has some glass wall between two. For example, excuse me, MDG was started in 2000, but there's still glass wall between development and security. The Brahmi report released in 2000, that the peace building defines more in-depth definition comparing to Agenda for Peace 1992. It's a far side of the conflict to reassemble the foundation of peace and provide the tools for building on those foundations, something that is more than just absence of war. That means more positive peace. Then this glass wall was blurred line since 2015. As you see, SDG 16 actually hinge on peace and strong institution and also human right. And also peace operation reports, we call HIPPO report. They are partner politics driven, flexibly responded, partnership needed, and people centered. It's a kind of a new way of thinking of a peace operation. More absence of violence to eradicate root causes of the conflict. Then finally, Antonio Guterres, new Secretary General, released his report on peace building and sustaining peace. It's more precise statement of the sustaining peace. So he highlights role of civil society and joint assessment, planning, and programming. Joint means civil society, public, intergovernmental, and bilateral donor. All actors must be work together. And third, more predictable and sustained financing. As you know, all ODA goes to preventive action is just 2% of total ODA. Even peace building budget of total ODA is only 10%. But that funding is still dependent on major 5 donors. So if one donor withdraw their funding, the peace building scheme can be easily collapsed. So he highlights more predictable and sustained financing for the civilian-led peace building. And also UN development system is kind of development work as a one team. Okay, peace building component can be divided. It is a varied definition, but mainly democracy and governance and justice and rule of law, economic revitalization, security and public order, infra and essential services. Let me go on. Our U.S. military government state building. Actually, U.S. government established a military government just after 1945. So, but during struggle and the ideological conflict of state building, efforts between South and North Korea, United Nations in cooperation with the United States launched ambitious relief and reconstruction mission in partnership with the United States to provide national political and economic support. With regard to democratic and governance, there are some ideological conflicts between right and left were very severe. But many center-left national self-reliance and determination group has a strong support and popular support at that time. But the United States is a bit reluctant to accommodate the diverse demands and voices of the community and population. The fact that about 50% of members of the Constitutional Assembly were independent party, not a party to political party. So that is the reason why withdrawal of left-wing parties implies the weak foundation of the assembly from the popular support. So our constitution, the promulgated July 1948, reflected the people's desire to realize freedom, equality, and dignity after revelation. The issue was raised as a participation of a pro-Japanese group in drafting committee under the influence of a U.S. military government, and more importantly, it did not fully represent the wishes of people who prefer social democratic value. Judicial and rule of law. I think one of our discussants, Dr. Chung, is a legal expert. He will be more appropriate to elaborate this part. But justice and rule of law is actually guarantee of rights and freedom of citizens in a multitude of the multiple meanings. So equal protection, non-discrimination of citizens, access to law, legitimate procedure, accountability of judicial authority, etc. But after revelation, the judicial system was separate. In Japanese imperialism, actually judicial system is integrated to executive. But after U.S. military government occupied our system, they separate the judicial system from executive. So nominally, we fulfill the principle of check and balance among state institutions. But Korean legal expert who used to be the minority of Japanese imperialism monopolized the judicial power in the system of rule of law. So they actually closed their group, and they actually closed the door to new group and new people get into their area. So establishment of judicial and rule of system through the enhancement of independence of judiciary in the procedure, practical, and minimalist approach could be lauded, but it often failed to fulfill responsibilities to ensure equal legal access and human rights in the substantive and comprehensive aspect of rule of law. Security and public order. Actually, after after independence from Japanese imperialism, there are so many self-governing military groups who were devoted to actually liberalization operation in various fields. And even after our independence, there are 162 local voluntary community policing center was established. But U.S. government denied all the self-governing military groups and 162 local voluntary community policing centers and disbanded them. Instead, it had implemented the procedure to establish new armed forces and police institutions. But the new armed forces, they recruited group used to serve Japanese and Manchurian armies as a mainstream. But after that, the Liberal Army and the left-wing army, Chosun Armed Forces, participated privately. But the police institution is quite problematic because they re-employed pro-Japanese personnel for the so-called stable transfer rather than the fundamental change which the public demanded. So security apparatus actively committed the violence suppressing leftist-oriented organization and significantly attribute to massacre of Jeju of April 3rd and the Yosu Suncheon incident in 1948. So it was ultimately one of the main factors causing the outbreak of the Korean War. So actually we had a failure of the security sector reform. Economic revitalization is the key to reducing gap between humanitarian aid and the development in the context of post-conflict reconstruction. So actually economic reconstruction and revitalization means not back to state quo system. It's a building back better. It's the main concept of economic revitalization. So our economic revitalization can be divided into period of relief and reconstruction 1948 to 1950, and then South Korean government from 1950 to 1953, and the reconstruction and stabilization support the period 1953 to 1960. So economic revitalization, there are many donors during that time. The United States, Economic Cooperation Agency, and a lot of USAID, a lot of bilateral donor agencies came into Korea to start their reconstruction work. Okay, and there are so many volume of aid actually channeled through the bilateral and multilateral donors. And the case study, Korean Credit Union movement, is one of the good example between mixture and relief and the development, also social economy and liberal economy. There are two founders of Korean Credit Union movement. Their principle, as you see, is open voluntary membership, democratic control, non-discrimination. As you see, there are many aid from government and non-governmental actors. Now, Korean Credit Union has 5.9 million members and 898 credit unions, and total asset is 68.5 billion. So fourth largest credit union system of World Council of Credit Union members credit union, and founding member of Asia Confederation of Credit Unions. So Korean Credit Union movement now contribute a lot to build the capacity of many credit unions in Asian Pacific region. So implication, that is a story as 2016, not a 2007, because we have a new leadership of KOICA. So KOICA has strived to new phase of SDG 16 initiative. So Korea aid to fragile states, comparing to other donor countries, a bit less. Actually, our volume is the 7th largest donor in ODA volume, but it's ranked the 16th ODA to fragile context. As you see, we have the 7th largest donor, but comparing to other donors to fragile context, we left behind than other donors. Even less committed to contribute to prevention of conflict, peace building, including security and public order. So Korea is only 0.3% of total ODA to fragile state, in particular some security and prevention of conflict and peace building. So learn from the South Korean case. We need a transformation approach that leads to more fundamental change of the cause of conflict. And also economic reconstruction and revitalization are quite important. But the peace building requires more broader and comprehensive and cross-sector perspective. So various sectors should be considered. democratization, good governance, human right-based justice and rule of law, and people-centered safety, security, and public order. So learn from U.S. military governments. They didn't know Korea well, because Korea is not their top list of the partner countries. So they are not good aware. They have actually lack of expertise in Korea. So in-depth analysis, understanding of the political, economic, social, and cultural context of the field in peace building should be stressed. So recommendation to South Korea in its initiative, the Peace ODA in SDG 16, relevant policy and implementing strategies should be aligned with peace building and state building goals and New Deal, we call the focus and trust principle, and peace building and sustaining peace agenda. So whole of government, interministerial approach to peace building initiative in ODA, it's a fragile context. We call it 3D, diplomacy, defense, and development. And awareness of multidimensional peace building and have peace competence should be raised in public and private actors. Not only KOICA, but also our civil society actors need to understand and aware of multidimensional aspect of peace building. And also I'd like to stress civilian peace builders in various fields should be cultivated to implement the building peace in achievement SDG 16. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a next speaker, Moibi Kamal. So you have 15 minutes as well.
Thank you, Professor Koson, for setting the tone and providing us with the history of peace building and how it evolved from being a very small part of international development to becoming a goal in the becoming a goal in the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030. So now that the commitment to peace at global level is recognized and it's part of the agenda, can we measure progress on this goal? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm from the Institute for Economics and Peace. We are a think tank, independent, and we have offices in New York, The Hague, Mexico City, Sydney. This presentation slide comes from an older presentation. We do have offices and sort of small representations in Brussels and Africa as well. Our research has a schedule, and this March we released the SDG 16 Plus Progress Report that tracks progress and data availability in 163 countries across the world, and it provides an empirical base for whether the progress on SDG 16 could be achieved, what are the problems, and what considerations should be taken into account. Then there's other research products. Global Peace Index is sort of the main one that ranks countries around the world on their level of peacefulness. And then there is the other indexes. So Global Peace Index takes the absence of violence or fear of violence approach, and it's in 3 domains: the internal peace, external peace, and militarization. There's 24 indicators which measures all these 4 things and provides a ranking from 1 to 5 for all the countries included in the index. So what is SDG Plus? It's the global commitment to peace directly through Goal 16, which is the goal for peace, justice, and strong institution, but also the additional sort of goals that comes within, or additional indicators that comes under the other goals within the Sustainable Development Strategy. And all of these goals that I have sort of taken here include some indicators that either directly addresses violence in societies, or they have factors that builds peace on that sort of the positive peace approach. It either builds the economy that helps sustain peace in fragile context or in conflict affected It reduces poverty, it reduces inequality, building human capital. All of these sort of builds the positive peace and provides basis for reduction of violence and a reduction in the risk of conflict in different societies. We, as I mentioned, in March we released a report to look at global availability of data and the possibility of measuring progress on Goal 16. The situation doesn't look too good. Out of the 44 indicators that we covered, only 9 indicators has data for 1 year. What this means is that it will not be an easy task to understand whether all the countries are achieving progress on these goals or not. Only 11 countries have more data for more than 90% of the countries. There are some indicators, for example, arms trafficking, sexual violence, underreporting of violence, and that especially is important for family, intimate sort of partner violence, for domestic violence, and for different types of violence that have severe underreporting issue, are comparable for less than 40% of the countries. So while there are some aspects of the SDG 16 that could be measured and the measuring progress is easy, there is a lot of challenges on the data aspect of it. Just to sort of add to this is that it's not very easy to collect data and have this measurement. We estimated for a very small country, for one indicator, if it's to be measured properly, it needs $600,000. Where it leaves us is that while progress, sort of measuring progress on SDG 16 is very important because that's how we will find out about success stories and failures and gaps, and we will adjust accordingly and provide help and support where it's needed. However, despite that importance, one needs to be taken into account is that we do not spend too much money on trying to create data or create new measures and undertake new data collection efforts. Instead, I think the lesson learned would be to try to focus on currently existing data, sort of composite indexes, and some qualitative measures to understand progress on SDG 16. These are some case study countries. So Zimbabwe, for example, provides 77% of the indicators could be measured, compared to Cuba, where 39% of the indicators could be measured based on available data. That was a global picture of whether we can measure progress on Goal 16. I will now focus on the Pacific region, on which we recently released a report, and the Pacific region has its own specific context. As Professor Gosun mentioned, Korea as a case for the US experts, Pacific is in that sense very different than other developing countries. Of course, every country has its own context, and context is very important for all sorts of development aid decisions, but the Pacific has some of its own. This report came out of our work with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australian government. It is funded by the DFAD. This sort of shows the project cycle, and there were 2 reports that we launched, and the first report sort of took an audit of the data, and then we conducted more research and collection of data and discussion with the stakeholders, and the second report was released. Now, the internal challenges within Pacific countries is there is interpersonal violence is one of the main challenge. Pacific countries are lucky in one sense that there is no active conflict or serious fragility that some country will fall into an active conflict. It has its history of those incidents happening, but currently it's not at that sort of risk countries or fragility. But there is intimate partner violence, violence against women, and interpersonal violence such as homicides and violent crimes are sort of the problems. There's land disputes issues that also leads to institutional problems and justice-related issues. And then there is the issue of political unrest and electoral violence. From time to time, this happens. Then there is the endemic issues across the region. Pretty much all the countries have low population. They're geographically spread. They're remote. They're not close to any big economic markets, and they have limited arable land, which creates sort of the issue of economic sustainability. I think this has been repeated. Now, there is the capacity-related challenges in the Pacific region, both in terms of achieving progress on SDG 16 plus and other sustainable development goals. And by this we mean much of the Pacific falls into law effectiveness and law capacity. Some of the countries fall into high effectiveness, high capacity, such as Fiji and Samoa. But a broader, sort of a bigger group of them falls here or in this sort of quadrant where both sort of government effectiveness and both sort of data capacity and government effectiveness both are low. When we say the capacity challenge, one of the issues with the capacity challenge is with such small population, they have very small governments and very few people working in all the sectors, but we just wanted to provide one example, the proportion of people who work in statistical offices where data on all sorts of progress is collected and stored and analyzed. And this graph shows somehow in some countries it could reach to 0.14% of their population, which if taken in a context of Korea or the United States or some other developed countries could be nearly 1 million people probably. Data availability for SDG 16, sort of the first column shows the different goals, and these different goals range from homicides, data on homicides that the police collect, violent crime that the police collect, to certain data on institutional capacity, on justice-related indicators such as the number of judges or the time it takes for a case to get processed, so there is different proxies. Then we see the global availability of data in the global context, and then we see in the Pacific context, except for a few goals that here and in the bottom, and probably here, we don't see the other goals having much data in the Pacific. So what practically this says is that there's going to be issues with trying to track progress in the Pacific region. This shows availability of different indicators by country, and Vanuatu probably sort of gives us the best option where the not available data column is very small and the available data is the biggest, and then we have at the end is where the availability data is pretty small and most of the indicators does not have any data. And this is some of the data collections that has happened or are planned to happen. And the reason I bring this sort of slide is that for the development practitioners and the development institutions, what they need to is, instead of creating new instruments and spending money and investing into the capacity building and trying to collect new data, these tools need to be used and these tools need to be utilized to collect data on different goals within the SDG 16. And this sort of shows the importance of data in every step of the data of the policy cycle. So data being instrumental in this and informs pretty much all these decisions. And the Pacific in this situation happens to be very data poor and there's not much data available. Now, how would we address this data limitation problem is that, as I mentioned previously, using existing data, and this is household data is collected on occasional basis, census are conducted on occasional basis, focus group discussions, expert surveys, all these happens within right now, and that should be used in a sense in a pre-planned way to include new questions or new data collection tools within these existing frameworks, or sort of use the currently available data. Then there is the design of new collection tools that could generate data, and that should be included in the existing planned data collection instruments. And then there are some innovative solutions that could be sort of considered, and these innovation solutions are, I'm going to come back to that in the next slide. So how would we use the existing data is knowing what is happening is, if there is a survey happening and if there is a data collection plan, the governments and the international sort of donor agency should get together and use those instruments to include new questions in it and new data collection opportunities, and that will sort of create the change and provide data for measuring SDG 16. There's other sources of the data that sort of gets regularly undertaken. For example, there is a lot of academic research that collects one-off data, and that data sort of stays somewhere. There's need for coordination and harmonization of that data sources to come together. But also, there is the sort of the secondary data collection institutions such as the Economics Intelligence Unit, the World Governance Indicators, WEDIM, the World Bank. They collect data and they store data, and that's already available data. That should be considered and used. Most of this data is publicly available except for one or two organizations. Then there is the CSO measures that needs to be sort of taken into account. And that was about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we have our next speaker, Ben Katoka, please.
Do I use this one? All right, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to have this presentation today here. So my presentation is about the challenge of achieving SDG 16 in the DR Congo, learning from bilateral ODA programs. So I have divided my presentation into six parts. I will start by, well, probably I will just skip this first part because the previous presenters have already talked about this. And then I will talk about the focus and key questions of my presentation. And then I will talk about the political context in the DR Congo. And next, I will talk about ODA and SDG 16 in the DRC. And then I will talk about the New Deal, the ODA and donor practices in the DRC, and then I will conclude. So first of all, I wanted to show this representation of the SDG and MDG. As you know, the SDG were adopted in 2015, but actually the idea that the SDG represent are covered or are closely related to the MDGs. And as you can see here, of the 17 SDGs, only 3 are not directly related to the MDGs, and this include SDG 16. Which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And the question is why this very important dimension of development was not taken into consideration by the MDGs. And as I said, the previous presenters already talked about the SDG 16, but what we have to know is that SDG 16 aims at promoting peace and inclusive society, provide access to justice, and most importantly, to build effective institutions, because without strong institutions, it is impossible to achieve development. All right. And based on some data, I don't know if you know the aid data, the data shows that between 2000 and 2014, more than 343 billion US dollars were directed to activities related to peace, justice, and institutional strengthening. This represents about 23% of total ODA. I think this figure is different from what the first presenter said. I think the previous presenter said that the ODA directed to SDG 16 represent about 10% of the total ODA, but actually these data are based on the descriptions of the development project between 2000 and 2014. So 23% of total ODA somehow represent a quite significant amount of ODA. And the DRC is, based on the data from the OECD between 2000 and 2015, the DRC is the second largest ODA recipient in Africa after Ethiopia. And the DRC has received quite significant amount of ODA since 2000 for many reasons, because in the mid-1990s, the DRC experienced conflict in the wake of the Rwandan genocide. I will come back to this later. And we had our first and second democratic elections in 2006 and 2011. So donors contributed quite significantly for this democratization process in the DRC. But the problem is, despite the huge amount of ODA disbursed in the country, the government capabilities are still very weak. And the question I'm going to talk about in my presentation is why, in spite of this significant investment from donors, the DRC still has very weak state capabilities. So two questions. The first one is, how do donors deliver their funding in the DRC? And the second one is whether ODA support institutional strengthening in the DRC. So to answer this question, I build on the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile State, which was adopted in Korea in 2011. And I will come back to this later, but what is very important to know is that the New Deal underlies the need for collaboration between donors and government in recipient countries. This means that donors have to put national actors at the forefront of state building activities. This means, according to the New Deal, the donors should give priority to government of recipient countries. So what I'm going to talk about is whether, based on the New Deal, whether donors give importance to the government of the DRC, or whether they deliver ODA through the government of the DRC. And, well, another very important principle of the New Deal is that it underlies the use of country systems as one core principle for aid to effectively contribute to strengthening various government capabilities in fragile states, including the DRC. So two important things to note here. First is that donors use country systems if their funding involves the recipient government as the main implementing partner. And on the other hand, aid delivered through non-state actors is not a type of aid that supports institution strengthening according to the New Deal. So in my analysis, I try to look at whether the ODA delivered in the DRC is mostly delivered through the government or through the non-state actors. But before that, I would like to just very briefly talk about the political context in the DRC. So what we have to know about the DRC is that before the Rwandan genocide in 1994, the country was quite stable. If you look, for example, at the Fragile State Index from the OECD or the World Bank or whatsoever index, you'll see that the DRC was not considered as a weak or fragile state. But after the Rwandan genocide, and for many reasons, the country has been experiencing resurgent conflict. And today the DRC has the largest peacekeeping mission in the world, with more than 15,000 soldiers and a budget of more than $2 billion annually. And as you can see in this map, major battlefields in the Congo are concentrated in the eastern part of the country, which means near Rwanda, Uganda here, and Burundi. And there are many reasons for that. Actually, most of the mineral resources are located in this part of the country. So, well, natural resources can be considered as one of the main instigators of conflict in the country. But apart from that, external actors, regional actors from Eastern Africa plays a very important role in the conflict going on in the DRC. All right, so that was it. And based on the situation in the Congo, there are some priorities. One is to strengthen political governance, to improve the justice system and accountability mechanisms, and to strengthen public administration capacity and improve provision of basic social services. And of course, very importantly, the stabilization of the Eastern DRC. And as I said earlier, donors have contributed a lot in order to help the DR Congo achieve this. And this figure shows the ODA trend in the DRC since 1990, and you can see that the flows of foreign aid are closely related to political circumstances in the DRC, with a very significant increase in the early 2000s. And the reason for this is because the second war in the DRC ended in 2002, and as a result, donors increased their aid giving to the country. And then we had our first democratic election in 2006 and the second one in 2011. And after the second election, you can see that the flows of foreign aid decreased quite drastically, and there are many reasons for that. Probably I will get back to this later. And based on data on ODA project, SDG 16 represent the second, received the largest amount of ODA after SDG 17. However, as I said earlier, in spite of this huge amount of ODA, the country is not experiencing any progress in terms of the state capabilities. And the reason for this is because the sectors targeted by donors are not, I would say, relevant for building the state capabilities. And to show this, I looked at the ODA trend, the aid giving of the DR Congo's 5 major donors, and this includes the United States, the UK, Germany, France, and Belgium. And together, these 5 countries provide more than, say, 80% of bilateral ODA to the DRC. And looking at the individual aid provided by donors, by these 5 donors, there are a quite significant difference between the donors. This is that some of these donors tend to deliver ODA through non-state actors. This includes the UK and the US. And these 2 donors deliver more than 50% of the bilateral ODA to the DRC. And on the other hand, other donors, France, Germany, and Belgium, they mostly deliver their ODA through the public sector, the government. But the problem is for the ODA given by the UK and the US, the sectors targeted, as I said, are not relevant for building the state institutions. So the point here is that the amount of ODAs delivered in the DRC is not enough for for saying whether ODA is supporting institution building in the DRC. But the problem is, as I said, the way ODA is delivered in the DRC is not helping the country strengthen its institutions. And in conclusion, the DRC receives significant ODA flows. And as I said earlier, the DRC is the second largest recipient of bilateral ODA in Africa. But problems including legitimacy, especially after the general elections we had in 2011, donors have tended to reduce the amount of ODA that they provide to the public sector. And apart from that, the government in the DRC is not really working hard toward, reforming the institutions. So even if the country receives a significant amount of ODA, the local actors are not doing much in order to build the institutions. And finally, I'm arguing that perhaps it is the establishment of a government with full confidence from the Congolese citizens and with confidence from donors that would result in better capacity development in the DRC. And we had an election in December last year, in December 2018, but the problem is the outcome of this election did not really help to address the legitimacy crisis we have in Congo since 2011. So it will be probably very difficult for donors to engage with the newly elected government in the DRC. So we expect to have the same problems for the coming years. So that was it, and thank you very much for listening.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite all speakers come in front. Please take a seat. Well, I think these three presentations show a very good balance. First presentation show about the Korean case, successfully moving out from fragility and achieving development. And the second presentation showed that the importance of the evidence and the data collections. Because the fragile situation, conflict is not just one unique phenomena. It has very complex and very diverse situation. So it is very important to know exactly what kind of situation we are in. So the data, evidence-based policy is really important. And the third presentation show the good case studies on the DR Congo and the really difficult task for fragile state or for donor countries as well. So I'd like to invite discussants to speak, but we have today rapporteur. So I'd like to introduce our rapporteur. Dr. Kim Sung-gyu, he is today's rapporteur. So please welcome. So why don't we go through as we said. So Dr. John, can you start first? And I will give you 5 minutes, but you don't have to use all 5 minutes if you like. 2
I'll
minutes
make
or
it
3
short.
minutes, then I can give you later 1 more minute.
Great, thank you very
Okay.
much. Thank you all, and especially Professor Kwon, for the opportunity to discuss this educative and interesting paper. It produces a thorough analysis of South Korean process in state and peace building. It discusses the lessons and the implications it may produce for fragile countries as well. I enjoyed the reading the paper in many, many ways, but I appreciate the implication of the city in particular for its cautious approach of lessons learned. And the fact that the paper stresses the importance of understanding the context of the field. I would like to explore this particular points further. As Professor Kwon, also Professor Mohib highlight, we often make a quick judgment and jump to understand others' fragility through our experiences or even success, if it is a right word, and undermine the role played by the local context, historical, social, cultural, and gendered context. So when it comes to a policy transfer or system transfer, I believe being cautious is the best merit needed. It is partially because a policy or a system transfer inevitably has a normative nature, which means that it functions as the means of spreading norms and delivers what it means to be right and what it means to be wrong. And such social and political construction of what is right and wrong surely has a power of social control over the people on what they believe and how they act on it. And scholars have that demonstrated in many ways that people with less power are more vulnerable to such social control. So despite the paper strongly stresses the importance of understanding the local context in policy transfer, I would love to hear a little more about how lessons from South Korean state and peace building can be learned without having to interfere the local system of fragile countries while placing the people under influence at the center of decision making and give them the control stick in the peace building. If I have a time to share my little dilemma, I had a research project on the custom of chapati, meaning in Nepal, meaning women during menstruation in Nepalese word, where women are excluded from daily activities and are expected to spend days at outside animal sheds because they are being understood as too polluted to enter their house or a kitchen during their menstruation period. And the biggest worry of our research team was that about the research itself and the related educational campaign on their menstruation and hygiene was that whether it is a right or if even a justice to send a message that what they strongly believe violates what we believe as the basic human rights, one's right to remain healthy, for example, while many people in Nepal, in fact, make an informed decision in regards to their culture. It has been hanging in my head for along the way, and I so far do not have a good answer for this dilemma, whether it is more of a normative suggestion judged from my experience and social and political backgrounds I experienced, or if it is a pure fundamental principle we have to address from a human rights perspective. So to speak from the same vein, the post-war South Korea was under a great ideological influence of the US's liberalist approach on economic revitalization process, and our current political, economical, and social structures are not independently built from the norms spread through NGOs and religious organizations. So to sum up, my concern or question is raised here is that to what extent do we have to acknowledge the norms contained within a development project? Or is it something we have to make an effort of separating them from the lessons we produce? Or do we just have to admit that it is an inevitable part of any development project and should rely on the power of the people in the recipient countries to fight for their own control stick? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So next, Sujin Kim, please.
Hi, I'm Sujin Kim from the KOICA, and at first, I totally agree with the old ideas and the presentation contents today's presentation, and I think the 3.0 presentation is focusing on the importance of the positive peace. And there are so many the discourse, but today I would like to focus on the second, the presentation, and the data collecting, and how the conflict analysis way, and how to collect the data and to manage them in the aid at the aid perspective. First, usually, as you all know, for the decades, usually a lot of the global peace index using the statistic, the data, they usually focus on the conflict and the war rather than the peace components. So, in this point, I think the IEPs, this kind of positive index, positive peace index, and SDG 16 index, those kind of can have a lot of the contribution to understand the SDG 16 plus and the SDGs, totally the SDGs goals. And also nowadays, actually a lot of international communities like the World Bank and OECD and UN, they also have a lot of the efforts to develop the conflict, the risk and the resilience assessments methodologies and the tools. For example, the World Bank already developed the risk and the resilience assessment tools and the model, and they usually, nowadays, they held a lot of the workshops with a lot of stakeholders, including the bilateral and the multilateral donors and NGOs. The goal why they want to disseminate the methodology is to coordinate a lot of stakeholders, the methodology, and they want to share the common understanding of the conflict, the area, the context. And then they want to save reduce the cost for developing and conducting their own conflict sensibility assessment. So it is also same line with the Dr. Iqbal, Iqbal's comments that nowadays the international community want to use the existing tool, not developing new one, because it can increase the confusion on how we can implement the peace or implement the HDP nexus. So that is very important point to use the existing tools. And also, considering the data availability, data collecting ways at the donor's perspective. Actually, 2 years ago, I visited the DR Congo, and I did the research, field research on how multilateral and the bilateral donors can implement the MNE when they are conducting the project. So at that time, the main point, there is a very interesting point. As you all know, the data availability is very challenging in the conflict areas. To attain the data in the country level, at first we should get the local levels data, and then compile that, we can get the regional level data, and then finally we can get the country level data. But how to do it? That is a very big problem, because the data, the kind of the data availability at the national level is very important to understand the state levels, the entire conflict, the status of the conflict, the countries. So very important, but very challenging. So for that, actually there's two key factors that I can found in the DR Congo. The first is donors' coordinated data managing umbrella system should be established in the context. And second is local capacity for managing data in there should be enhanced. The two is a very important point. In particular, in the DR Congo, before initiating the next year's project, usually the bilateral and the multilateral donors get together and they look into the DR Congo's the development, the national development strategies, and also the UN's UNDAF, UN UNDAF, that is UN's development assistance, the framework. After that, they collect the priority at the perspective of DR Congo, and then they after that they can make some kind of the algorithm outcomes at the state level, and then under the set, or at that time 3 or 4 domains, they categorize their own priorities. So at first, they consider they put their competitive advantages of the project and their priority sectors, priority regions, and the timeline, those kind of things. They just spread it, and then they can share together, and they categorize the work into under the specific categories. It's very effective because their work can create the local levels data, and then compiling their local data, they can make a regional level data, and then it can be the state level data under the same categories of the outcome. So it is very ideal. There is a lot of in reality there should be the gap. But this kind of systemic approach is, I think, the very good thing to intervene into the conflict areas. And also, I think this kind of thing is not different to the concept of the HTTP nexus. HTTP nexus is just we can say that is not the new one, and that is not ideologic one. That is just managing the intervention approach, I think. How to do it? Yeah. So actually, the main point of the HTTP nexus is the integrating the intervention ways between the different actors. And the point is they use their own competitive advantages, and also they should not interrupt each other's vision and the principles. So the main point is how to cooperate. So I think the specific one, we need to look into the HTTP nexus specific one. This case is not explain everything of the HTTP nexus. But HTTP nexus, when you think about the HTTP nexus, we should think about how to monitor it. So it can be some good example as a part of the HTTP nexus, I think. Yeah, so the last week, I joined the INCAF meeting, the task team meeting. One of the key finding was, actually, until the last year, I felt that usually a lot of the HTTP nexus, discourse is very ideal, not practical. But one of the surprising points this time is the INCAF revealed the doc recommendation on the HTTP nexus, and they planned for the pilot the case study regarding how to apply this kind of the recommendation, the contents into the reality. And also the IDPS, the DR Congo is as the G7 plus the member, and the DR Congo also implementing the New Deal. In the case of the IDPS, they also joined the meeting, and they explained the peace vision. Peace vision that will be really officially released in the HGPF meeting this year, July. The main point of the peace vision is they consider the SDG 16 plus as well as they consider the HTTP nexus. So they also now organizing the committee for the vision, and they were also planning to implement the case studies. How the SMUCHI 7 plus members implement New Deal effectively by considering in consideration of the HTTP nexus and the SDG 16 plus as well. Yeah, so that is the main point. And I think nowadays a lot of the case studies and the discourse on the HTTP nexus and how to help the conflict areas, a lot of things are already opened, I think. The next step is how to tailor it into our strategy and the action plans. But there is a very big gap between the policy, the discourse and the practice. But the next step is our adjust that and the put into the reality. Yeah, in our the guidelines like this. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Dr. Jung to
yes. Hi, everyone. I was, while listening to the speakers and also the fellow discussants, I actually reread the title under which we are talking about the issues at hand. It reads Peace and Development Nexus in the context of Asia-Pacific region, donors and partners' perspectives. Yet, from the presentations today, I was not able to get the clear nexus between peace and development. Maybe that was how the tasks were given to you by focusing on the SDG 16. So I would like to just raise three things. One is the relations between the SDGs. What I mean by this is I just want to talk about SDG 13, which is climate change. I was quite surprised. I mean, just going back a few steps, I was quite surprised to look at Professor Kadoka's presentation about the ODA, the money, how much money is going to the peace building, whereas for climate change, there was basically nothing. However, from the various views of the policymakers and scholars, climate change is the biggest threat to both peace and development around the world. And by addressing the climate change, we can address other issues like peace and development, or even poverty reduction, or other SDGs. So having the holistic view of how to deal with the SDGs would be something that I think we must focus on in addressing the issues at hand. And by what I mean by climate change, excuse me, is that I mean, just to draw an analogy from the miniseries, The Game of Thrones, winter is coming, and or in this case, the winter is already here. The climate change is indiscriminate. It doesn't discriminate between donors and also the receivers, and the rich and the poor. It affects everyone, and by ensuring that we are focused on this issue, another added benefit is to have a kind of an opportunity for all the parties involved to promote culture of cooperation among for all the citizens around the world. So that's my one point. And the other one is I would like to, I'm not naming anyone by name, but it seems you are considering ODA as just one block. But if you can divide ODA into different parts, ODA consists of grant, loan, and technical assistance. It's definitely something that you should look at because there is always a possibility of finding the optimal mix of such ODA tools to bring about the goals of what the donors want or what the receivers want. So I just want to, in this instance, talk about my organization. So I'm with the GGGI, Global Green Growth Institute. It is a treaty-based international organization with 33 members, founded by 13 original members, including Korea, Australia, excuse me, Denmark, Norway, UAE. Well, as you can see from the names of these countries, they are basically mid-sized countries, all members of G20. And this was basically a contribution of those G20 countries gathered together during the G20 summit in 2010. And this organization provides policy advisory service and also the financial, the capacity building for developing countries to receive the green finance from multilateral development bank or international funds like IMF, GCF, or AFDB, or others. So I just also want to emphasize the fact that ODA, while bilateral ODA consists of most ODAs, well, the use of international institutions like GGGI as a provider of public good can also be quite helpful in resolving many issues that the countries face. And I would lastly like to draw upon the issue of North Korea. So, Dr. Kwon, you talked about how Korea was able to get out of, deep poverty, with or without the help of others, but, we did it ourselves. But what about our northern brethren? They're still suffering. I'm sure the insurmountable suffering, human suffering in the north, and so I think this is something that we have to also address when addressing the Korean question. And just for your edification, my organization is mindful of our unique strategic positioning on the peninsula. And we are at the moment now talking directly with North Korea as to how to address the challenges, especially on green growth challenges. So that we are hopeful that such engagement with North Korea would be conducive to both development and peace, which will be also conducive for the peace and security and for the entire world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ho?
Thank you. I'd like to talk about the good, the bad, and the global. What I mean is that 2 years ago, I was lucky, was dispatched by KOICA to visit different institutions in Germany, to visit how different institutions in Germany embracing SDG 16 into their development works. A lot of German diplomats and academics warned me, and they said, are you really going to do this? Do you know what SDG 16 about? You are opening up the very uncomfortable box in development. So I think that it's very important time for us, especially our academic associations and our colleagues here today talk about SDG 16. I think we need to be a little bit more clear that what we are talking about. If we lost the concept of SDG 16 ourselves, I don't think we can work with a lot of partners. I don't think our partners will understand what do we mean by peace and development nexus. Because it's, if we make it too complex, then our stakeholders will not take the peace seriously in terms of international development. If we make it too simple, I think that we'll lose a sensitivity to talk about the issues of peace in our development policy and priority. I'd like to talk about three tensions that what I am experiencing working around the SDG 16 issue, especially with the peace. Firstly, I joined the KSDG process, and I was a part of KSDG goal development in SDG 16 and SDG 4. I was incredible because a lot of my colleagues come from representing different institutions, especially government institutions in Korea. We gathered together, tried to make sense of SDG 16. And a lot of my colleagues said, where do SDG 16 belong? It does not belong anywhere. It's not part of my work. Is it part of your institution's work? It's not SDG 4, it's not SDG 3, so it's not like health or education. So it seems like everybody should care, but nobody should actually care in terms of their actual day-to-day works and research and policy making. So it was quite fascinating to see that health sector and education sector, I work a lot in education, the building as KSDG was very, it's not easy task, but it was clear. Because health and education, we had a long history of building national statistics, we have clear policies, and we just need to add a little bit of ODA here and there. But with SDG 16, we had it was not disaster, but it was quite tough process of making sense of why we are here. I think that the issue was that we did not quite understand that SDG 16 is a truly transformative agenda that opens up the issues that we actually did not deal with on the MDG. So I think that as Korean ourselves, we have not talked about justice, empowerment, and not effective institution, but we talk about justice and institution, not effective institution. It's a different issue. So I think that we are open up with this very difficult issue. It's a very political, social process of making a democratic institution. So I think that the linking domestic works to do with SDG 16 with international works, somewhat opening up this box that we haven't actually talked about it. I think it's very difficult, but I think it's also very exciting, because I think also challenges how we work within Korea, how different institutions, different think tanks work based on one goal. I'm in charge of goal 4. Your institution is in charge of goal 6, and we don't work together. So I think that SDG 16 and also climate change and other goals really fundamentally challenges the way we work. I think that we now tend to work together. So I think that SDG giving opportunity for us to work together. So I think that our colleagues were screaming, where does SDG 16 belong? I think it's a very good question. Second of all, I really enjoyed that our colleague point out that the SDG 16 is not only single goal, just a single group of targets, but it is related to number 1, 4, 5, 8, 10, 11, especially with the gender goals and other goals. And I think that making linkage between other goals, if we don't talk about it, I think we will lose the fundamental meaning of SDG. So how do we collaborate together? I think this is a big challenge. So we can talk about in policy forums and English-speaking sessions like this, but when it really comes to sector strategy, when it really comes to program development, when it really comes to evaluation process, these meanings disappear. So I think that we need to really seriously talk about it. So when it comes to data management and database and evidence-driven policy making and program monitoring and evaluation, I think there's a huge gap between what we are talking about here and the institutional level statisticians understand that we need to go beyond the health statistics. How do we persuade health specialists to understand that health is related to their women's empowerment? Health is related to the democratic governance. How do we work together? I think this is not just a technical issue that we can put in one indicator here and there, but it's actually a mind-changing process. I find it's really hard. So I really appreciate that this will maybe change in the future the way we work. But I think that talking about also justice and peace and democracy in development, also there's another issue, political issues. Our colleague come from Australia, and we have comment that we studied in Australia together. There is a reason why Australia supports Pacific. It's very clear that diplomatic foreign policy makes sure that countries in Pacific are safe enough so refugees don't come down to Australia. So that's the foreign policy that Australia has, and that's why Australian aid is pouring into the Pacific. So I don't think we can actually be blind about it. Another Australia's foreign policy and international development that maybe we can learn is that how Australia have worked with Southeast Asia. I think that in the future, maybe your institute and our academic association could work together, that your amazing reports come out, positive peace or the SDG 16 progress report. Maybe we could work together, working with our Southeast Asian partners in the future together. So I think that this kind of difficult issues that if we don't talk about, because this year is the 4th year that SDG introduced, we don't talk about right now, and if our colleagues do not understand this, I think we'll have a tough road ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think time is up, but still I think we should give opportunity to the floor to raise one or two comments or questions. Anyone would like to raise one? Right. Okay, you have one.
Just building on the previous comment. My name is Artemy Izmestiev, and I come from the UNDP Seoul Policy Center, and very similar to the previous commenter. At one of the conferences that I attended this year in China, there was a question from the Chinese participant, also in relation to the SDG 16. Why you have so many initiatives on the SDG 16? And we, as all of us believers in the SDG 16, had very hard time to respond, simply because, yes, we believe in it deeply, and we try to say yes. We address right now governance differently. It's related to other goals. We address the nexus between governance and other things. But we had too few examples to show. We had too few things to demonstrate. Too little evidence. And this is why I think we really need to be ready. Because there are sort of people out there, the skeptics, that will be asking this sort of questions. But the question that I also wanted to ask to the participants is in relation to other the issue that has been in a number of presentations. It's the New Deal. It was in a number of presentations in relation to the past and to the present. From one side, we heard that based on the past, the recommendation was that now we can follow the New Deal, and this is and we can do things better. From the other side, based on the case study, we can see that we follow the New Deal and things are not getting much better.
Okay.
Are there any comments on that?
Yeah. Well, because we have a time's up, but I like to give each presenters 10 seconds. Don't try to reply everything. Just to summing up what you want to say. 10 seconds each.
To make it simple, we should know who is the main player for the peace building. It's not an outsider, but insider. I mean, the people in the conflict, the fragility, the people inside is a major player for the peace building. And I totally agree that climate change and the conflict, so it both is correlated a lot. Thank you.
To be very brief, I think the reason we have SDG 16 in the development strategy and the global development strategy is the nexus between development and peace. That's, I think, violence and positive peace both are sort of addressed in that. Second point to quickly make on climate change is climate change is missing in the peace agenda, not only in the international agenda, but also when you go around in the academia, in the think tank world, there has been very little attention on the nexus between climate change related issues and how it creates violence, how it creates conflict. This year, in June, one of our major reports are coming out, and we have looked at sort of very basic and very preliminary scoping of whether climate change is directly related to violence, the escalation of violence and violence in societies. And the third part, to sort of bring it back to data, yes, data is important, but data is also very difficult to collect and very expensive to collect.
Yeah, thank you very much. Answering the question about the climate change, yeah, I think the project that prioritize peace also somehow address climate change. For example, in Congo, some projects that are related to peace, they also address, for example, conflict related to land or other environmental issues in the Congo. And the other point you raised was that we do not differentiate between different types of ODA, like loans, grants, and technical assistance. But what I can say about this is that by talking about ODA, we talk about loans and grants. But technical assistance cannot be put in the same category. I would say technical assistance is a sort of instrument of ODA in general. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have a very nice sessions and very good presentation and discussions. I don't think we answer the questions. We raise the questions. And these questions to our COICA colleagues as well, not only COICA, but also Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Korean government, Korean civil society members, and scholars. This is really difficult issues, but the Korea must stand up and to address these difficult issues as a international member, mature member of the global society. Thank you very much.